I was born and raised in New York City, but when it was time for college, I decided to attend a school down in New Jersey. During my first semester there, I made a friend named Holly, who was a sophomore at the time, and took me under her wing. As someone who didn't have any family, having aged out of the system after my mother died when I was 15, Holly often invited me back to her family home for the holidays. It felt nice to be around her and her family, sort of like how I felt when I had my mother around. When my sophomore and Holly's junior year started in September, her family all decided to take a long weekend at a campsite to celebrate us going back to school for another semester. The group wasn't as big as it usually was. It consisted of 7 people, who included Holly, me of course, Holly's mother and father, her grandparents from her mother's side, and her little brother, Coda. The campsite they decided on was called Moon Valley Campground, and it was the perfect location for a beginner like me who'd never been camping before. The site was clean, secluded, and private for the most part. There were other campsites nearby, which made you not feel so alone in the great outdoors, but far enough away to give you an illusion of isolation. As long as you stuck to the marked trails, even the most inexperienced camper or hiker would find their way back to their campsite. The trip started normally. We set up camp, made some food on the campsite's grill, and listened to stories Holly's family told around the fire. Holly and her family were native, Navajo to be specific, so I heard many legends and stories that sent shivers down my spine. All too soon, we headed into our tents to sleep. Holly and I shared a tent, so we stayed up a couple more hours, just talking about the first week of school and whatever crushes we had at the time. Holly fell out before I did, and I was right behind her when a voice woke me up not too long later. I remember sitting up, confused. I waited for the voice to come again, but after several minutes, it didn't. So I tried going back to sleep when I heard it again. A soft female voice that was calling my name. Veronica. The voice whispered my name, and the feeling that I knew the voice wouldn't leave me. I tried thinking of where I heard the voice before, but was so tired I couldn't recall. Veronica. The voice called out to me again. Don't ask me why, but I wanted to know where the voice was coming from. The voice wasn't scary, but sounded comforting. It sounded like a warm hug on that cold fall night. Soon, I found myself in the middle of the woods. That's when fear set in, and I started to walk back from the voice. But then the voice, that had started so sweet, so familiar, started screaming for help, calling out my name, asking me to save her. I was frozen in place because I had finally woken up enough at that point to recognize the voice. It had been whispering, so I barely heard it, but when it screamed, I knew instantly who it was. It was my mother's voice. My mother was calling me, begging for help, and I needed to get to her. I tried to run toward the voice again, when arms wrapped around me from behind and dragged me back toward the campsite. I screamed, kicked, and fought the person who was pulling me back with tears in my eyes. When we got back to the campground, Holly's family was waiting by a newly made fire with concern in their eyes. I looked at the person who grabbed me and started pounding on his chest, crying about my mother. The person was Holly's father, who let me get my sadness out before he grabbed me into a hug as I cried for my mother. When I calmed down enough, Holly's grandfather asked me what had lured me out into the woods, and I told him. As I listened to myself tell him I heard my mother's voice, calling out for me to save her, I realized how insane I was to follow the voice, because, painful or not, my mother was dead. Holly's grandfather waited until after I finished my story, and then he told me he wanted to tell me one more legend, one he should have told me about since we were in the middle of the woods. That's when he told me the story of the skinwalkers, of how there are evil creatures that walk among us who oftentimes use the voice of loved ones to lure people toward them. And that's the reason why, no matter how far I walked, I never got closer to the voice. It was just luring me away from the safety of camp. Holly had woken up to me walking away, almost in a trance, and had tried to follow me to bring me back to camp. She thought I was sleepwalking until she heard me call out my dead mother's name. She knew then what was happening and ran back for help. After her grandfather finished the story, Holly's family quickly packed up camp and we left, and we've never been back. My heart goes out to others like me who are still grieving the loss of a loved one. My name's Lily, and I'll tell you about the time I went camping with my friend Sarah and her 2 cousins. It was one of those things I never thought I'd do, given my slight aversion to the great outdoors. But there I was, sitting in Sarah's car, heading to an unfamiliar patch of woods for a weekend camping trip. We arrived, set up our campsite, and got a fire crackling. We sat around the fire telling stories and jokes. It didn't feel as bad as I thought it would be. The light was fading fast, and soon the woods around us turned dark. That's when it all started. As we were laughing and joking, we began to hear these weird noises, like rustling leaves and faint footsteps, almost as if someone, or something, was creeping around us. At first, we thought it might be some deer or critter wandering nearby, but the sounds, they weren't like any animal I'd ever heard. They were too deliberate, too human, like they were trying to be quiet and stealth-like, but were not very good at it. The 2 guys, Tom and Jake, decided to go and check it out. They went off into the woods, armed with just their flashlights. Sarah and I waited for them nervously but patiently, sitting close to the fire, feeling the night pressing in on us. But after what felt like an hour, we heard this blood-curdling scream echoing from the trees. Without thinking twice, Sarah and I bolted for the car, not caring if it was parked a little out of the way. We scrambled in, shaking, and locked the doors, frantically calling for help. We eventually managed to get through to my dad, and I told him everything about the noises, the footsteps, and that scream. Luckily, Sarah had given my dad directions for where we would be staying, otherwise he wouldn't have let me come. He called Sarah's dad, and they set off to come find us, calling the police on the way. Thankfully, a search and rescue team was dispatched, and they found the guys. Tom was stuck in some kind of bear trap. It broke his ankle, hence the scream we heard. But here's the creepy part. They said they saw someone in the trees watching them. They couldn't see anything distinct, and at first wasn't even sure if it was someone until they saw the glow of his cigarette. That's why Jake stayed back and didn't run for help. He thought it was safer to keep Tom company, rather than running off and leaving him vulnerable. A pretty smart move, I think. They assumed we would hear the scream and try to get help, or at least come to find them. It was like someone had set a trap intentionally to lure them out, using those noises as bait. They were led away from safety by those weird sounds, and then trapped. The scariest part, the person they saw in the woods was never found. It's like he vanished into thin air. The whole incident left us spooked and feeling like someone was still out there, watching. The silence in those woods, it wasn't just quiet, it was haunting. You could almost feel it, thick and heavy, like someone was there but hiding and watching from the shadows. We packed up as soon as our dads and the search and rescue team arrived and never looked back. Even now, I can't shake the feeling of those deliberate footsteps and that chilling scream echoing in the night. It was a camping trip I'll never forget, and one that's made me think twice about ever going back into the woods. There are things out there, things that watch and wait, and sometimes it's better not to find out what they are. I loved camping when I was little. My mom and dad always used to take me and my brother. We would eat junk food and drink sodas around the campfire, and I had lots of good memories. It's always something I wanted to do as an adult, but sometimes life just gets in the way. Anyhow, some of my friends asked me if I would be up for going camping. They had a huge tent, and I would just need a sleeping bag and some food and drink, as everything else would be provided. I figured, why not? It seemed like a chance to break away from the daily grind and have some fun, and no doubt there would be some nostalgia. So there I was, packed into a car with my friend Sophia and 2 of her friends from work. We headed to a nearby woods for a weekend getaway. When we arrived, everything was already set up by the rest of the group, who had set off before us to get an early start. There was a massive family tent. I'm talking about the kind of tent you can stand up and throw a party in. There were camping stoves, a pop-up table, and chairs and a kitchen area to wash up. The idea was simple. Spend the weekend drinking, laughing, and just enjoying each other's company. The first night was pretty typical. We roasted marshmallows, laughed about old times, and made plans for the next day. It was all fun and games until we went to bed and all went to sleep. I'm a pretty heavy sleeper, but that night, something woke me up. A low, guttural growling echoed around the tent, jolting me from my sleep. No one else seemed to be awake or paying any attention, but I know I heard something. My heart was racing. It was dark, and the growls sounded close, too close. Then, eventually, I saw other people start to wake up, as whatever was growling just outside our tent was circling us. The footsteps slowly making their way around the tent as if whatever it was trying to find a way in. One of the men, Timothy, being the macho one, had a gun with him. He clutched it, ready to use it if needed. We were all silent, listening intently. But whatever it was had stopped moving. It was right in front of the entrance to the tent. It didn't make a sound, but we all sat there staring at the entrance, waiting for whatever it was to come bursting in. Then, something hit the back of the tent. It was hard to tell if it was something being thrown at the tent, or someone or something pressed against it. Sophia asked, "What is that? Is there more than one?" Timothy told her to shush as he sat there with his gun. We all just sat there, in fear that the night was about to take a nasty turn. The growling stopped, eventually, but none of us could sleep. We stayed holed up in the tent, whispering and guessing what it might be. It felt like an eternity before the first light of dawn peeked through the trees. That's when we decided to check outside. I remember Emily unzipping the tent flap cautiously, peering out, but there was nothing. No signs of disturbance, no trace of whatever caused those eerie noises. It was like a regular morning in the woods, quiet and peaceful. We all exchanged nervous glances, feeling a little spooked, but brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just some curious animal passing by. We decided to make breakfast and gather our stuff to leave. Throughout the day, though, the uneasiness lingered. Even in the daylight, there was an odd tension. We couldn't shake the memory of those growls and the inexplicable sounds from the night before. We decided enough was enough, and we packed up. I couldn't help but glance around, half expecting to see something lurking in the woods. But there was nothing. No footprints, no broken twigs, absolutely nothing out of place. We never found out what was out there that night. Was it a curious bear, a wandering coyote? The mystery lingered, haunting our thoughts as we nervously packed and left. The whole ride back, there was an unspoken tension. No one wanted to admit it, but we were all rattled. It felt like we narrowly escaped something, but we didn't know what. To this day, it remains a mystery, one of those odd, unexplainable moments that are forever etched in our memories. It's a reminder that the woods hold secrets, and sometimes it's best not to know them. That camping trip changed my perspective on the great outdoors. It's beautiful, sure, but there's a mystery and darkness lurking beneath those trees, something you can't quite put your finger on. But you better believe I won't be camping anytime soon. That experience was enough to last me a lifetime. My name's Alex. I'm a bit of an introvert. You know the type, who loves being out in the wild, away from the noise of the city and all the crazy people who live there. I like my alone time, just me and nature. This one time, I headed out for a solo camping trip. I found a spot a bit further afield to where I usually go. I pitched my tent, dug a hole, and gathered some wood for a fire, and then went exploring. I had done some research on the area and had seen some caves nearby that I wanted to go and check out. Now, I'm no cave expert, and I didn't want to go too far in. You know, safety first and all that. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, and didn't want to risk getting lost in some twisty cave. In I went, and as I'm poking around, I swear I saw something moving way down one of the tunnels. Gave me the jitters, I tell ya. Didn't want to mess around, so I hightailed it out of there, making sure nothing followed. Night rolls in, and I'm laying in my sleeping bag. I'm tired, so I fall asleep within about 10 minutes. I'm not sure how long I was asleep, but next thing I knew, I'm being yanked out of the tent by my feet. It's dark, and all I see is the silhouette of someone on top of me, pounding on my face and body. I defended myself the best I could by raising my arms in front of my face, but I still took a beating. Finally, the guy stops, snatches my bag and wallet, and bolts into the woods. I'm left there in the middle of nowhere, robbed and rattled. I both wanted and needed to get out of there, but my keys were in that bag. It was too dark to find my way around in the middle of the night, so I decided to stay put until there's enough daylight to navigate my way around. Morning arrives, and I hustle back to where I parked my ride, but it wasn't there anymore. I could see the tire treads on the floor, so I knew I was in the right spot. It was a good 3-hour walk back to the main road. I was tired, aching and sore from my beating. Eventually, another car drove past, and I was able to flag it down. A couple of hunters stopped and gave me a ride. They said they would keep an eye out for my car and anyone acting suspicious, but I don't know if they ever came across anything. I got in touch with the cops, spilled the beans, but again, I never heard anything. They never found that guy or my car. This whole thing gives me the creeps. The wilderness is a wild place. You never know what's lurking out there. This experience taught me a lesson. Love the outdoors, but always be super careful. Tell someone where you're going and keep your eyes peeled, because there are some real shady characters wandering around in the woods, and you might just bump into them when you least expect it. When I tell people that I have a true horror story about camping, a lot of them react by raising a smile and sarcastically rolling their eyes. For them, the idea that the words true and horror could coexist in the same sentence seems ridiculous, especially when it's one of those stories related to camping. Many of them assume when I say horror that I mean the types of horror you find on cinema screens or in the horror novel section of the local bookshop. They imagine a story about ghosts or monsters lurking in the bushes, wendigos and werewolves emerging from darkened woods to chase those who dare to trespass upon their territory. They expect, I suppose, to hear some nonsense about witches screaming profane rites at the moon, or myths of Sally Longbones stalking between the trees. What they don't expect, and what they always get, is the truth, in all its plausible, possible, and naked horror. No ghosts, no witches, just facts. Horrible, horrible facts. For my friends and I, camping was an escape. A way to get drunk as a teenager without having to navigate the possible pitfalls of being refused entry by bouncers, harassed and slobbered over by drunken idiots who decided they were your best friend after a few drinks, or being forced to fight in taxi queues when those same idiots turned nasty a few drinks later. Compared to these experiences in town, the hardship of lugging your tent and a few crates of beer into the woods or hills surrounding the town seemed like no work at all. Out in the woods, sitting around a hastily constructed fire, we were free to drink, talk, and be our unvarnished selves without having to worry about offending anyone or keeping the noise down. Out there, you could behave however you wanted, because most of the time, you were entirely alone. Unfortunately, sometimes you weren't. This was one of those times. The last time I ever went camping was in 2015. My buddy, who worked at the local supermarket, had spent the afternoon surreptitiously attaching barcodes meant for tins of beans to crates of beer, so that when he scanned them through the tills at the end of his shift, they would cost him pennies rather than pounds, in a process he always insisted was more mislabeling than stealing. We had arranged to pack up the tent and sleeping bags and meet him directly from his shift so that we could head up to Parker's Woods and set up camp long before the sun went down. While he scanned his beans through the till, we distracted the other cashier by purchasing a disposable barbecue and a few cheap sausages for our dinner. Then we merrily trotted out with our discounted beverages and headed into the hills. For the first few hours, everything went as normal. We set up camp in the woods a few hundred yards from the edge of the lake, picked at the badly undercooked sausages and sunk cans of beer while discussing our usual favorite topics of football, girls, and girls again. It was only a few hours after the sun went down that the shadow of apprehension began to grow long around us. A shadow cast not by the fire we had built, but by another fire, worryingly visible across the water on the other side of the lake, a few hundred yards into the tree line. like a mirror of our own activities. Usually, when we came out here, we were perfectly alone. Never had we considered the possibility that the same drunken idiots we came up here to avoid might actually have a similar idea and set their own camp up in the woods. While it might not sound like much, when I say it now, the sight of that other fire, the sounds of the yelps and high-pitched laughter from the other side of the lake made us all nervous. If we could see the other fire, that meant they could see us. We had no intention of leaving our camp, but what if the lads in the other camp didn't feel the same way? We were a long way from town, and if they decided, once they ran out of beer themselves, that they might want to share some of ours, there would be little we could do to stop them wandering over and simply taking it. Especially if they had come to camp carrying knives, as they often did in town. It was the kind of thing these idiots did a lot, and the kind of thing we had actually come up here to avoid. Deciding that this was the kind of attention we didn't want, we agreed to dampen the fire down in the hope that we hadn't been spotted and try to keep the noise down. When we started to hear shouts coming from the other camp, calls of "Oi," and the more worrying "You got any beer?" screamed from the other side, we decided to put the fire out altogether and retire to our tent. I know this sounds cowardly, like we decided to just curl up and hide, and there's a good reason for that, because it's exactly what we agreed to do. We hoped, by masking the fire and disappearing into our tents to whisper, we would be camouflaged enough by the darkness to avoid being spotted. So that's exactly what we did. For around an hour, the plan seemed to have worked. We whispered together in the tent, and the noises from the other side of the lake seemed to have died down, as the other camp passed out in what we assumed was a collection of drugged and drunken stupors. But then, like the cliched moment in every camping horror story, we heard a branch snap. We all froze, remaining perfectly still and silent. We listened as the twigs and leaves crumpled and snapped underfoot. Someone was close. Moving with little concern for stealth or silence, they clattered loudly through the woods close to our camp. Still, we remained silent, hoping that John's camouflage tent would conceal us, while we tried as best as we could even to reduce the sound of our breathing to a delicate hush. We waited and waited, trying to gauge from the volume of the footfalls just how far away the walker was. But then, as suddenly as they'd started, the noises simply stopped. For a full 5 minutes, none of us spoke. Instead, we simply lay there listening and waiting. Just as I was about to break the silence, to ask whether the walker had gone, we heard the sounds of screams coming from the other camp. At first, we were reluctant to leave the tent, but as the pitch and severity of the screams increased, rising from simply a shout of panic to a hideous, gurgling splutter of staccato cries, we decided to unzip the tent and look out. What we saw was fire. It was burning in the same place on the other side of the lake, only now the fire was no longer an orange glow partially masked by the mesh of branches and leaves, but a blaze. A tower of yellow and amber flame that covered and greedily consumed an entire patch of wood. Knowing that we would not be able to get reception on our phones from there, we did the only thing we could. We sprang from the tent and ran toward the flames, sprinting as fast as we could around the perimeter of the lake to reach the opposite shore, hoping that we could help whoever was screaming. We couldn't. By the time we reached the opposite bank, the flames had died down, but the tower of noxious black smoke still whirled and eddied up into the sky. I suppose I knew, even before I reached the camp, that something awful had happened. I remember as we approached that the cloying smell was not of wood smoke as our fire had been, but was instead the acrid stink of melted plastic, layered over another far more familiar smell, the aroma of cooked meat. What we found when we arrived at the camp were remains. Charred, twisted, and blackened things that had once been people. In places on their bodies, huge patches of molten orange dripped, where the surface lining of the tent had melted to their flesh, the entire thing having enveloped them so that they were cooked inside the material, as if they'd been shrink-wrapped and placed in an oven. The police, who interviewed us several times over the coming days, never did catch the culprit. It was explained to us later that someone had decided, for whatever reason, to use duct tape and nails to seal up the zipper of the tent and secure it in place before setting it alight with the 3 teenage boys inside. Whether this was a planned attack, a gang-related murder, or simply a random action taken by a deranged local was never confirmed. What was confirmed, and at one point used in an attempt to point the finger of blame at us, was the fact that 2 rolls of duct tape were found in the woods on the opposite side of the lake, not 50 yards from where our camp was set up. Had our tent been found, then in all likelihood, we would have met a similar end. Perhaps now you see why my camping horror story resonates a little more than tales of monsters and ghosts. Why, since 2015, I've never allowed myself to step inside of a tent, and why I probably never will again. You know all the safety measures they advise you to take before you go hiking? The ones that should keep you safe and make sure you don't become a bear's snack. Yeah, I always took them as gospel. I respect nature, and I respect the rules, and it didn't matter. You can do everything completely right and still have shit hit the fan at any point. That's just life. One stroke of bad luck, and you're done. We were in a group of 5 people, all of us very good friends, going to the Appalachian Mountains as a way to say goodbye to college. Luzia, Anthony, Jordan, Rebecca, and me. Luzia was our leader, the one who always took care of mapping the locations we'd visit and the trails we'd take. She always did an impeccable job, and we were everywhere we needed to be, right on time, every time. Anthony and Jordan were the ones responsible for our food and water, and we always had a few leftovers that we could snack on after the trip was over. Rebecca was our survivalist, and I was our medic. We packed everything we needed if things went south. It was foolproof. There was no way we'd ever get stuck in a bad situation, and even if we did, we were more than capable enough to hunker down and wait for rescue. If only. Like I said, a group of 5 going to the Appalachian Mountains one last time before we finished college, and adult life inevitably made it harder for us to have our little adventures together. It was supposed to be a 9-day trip, with 6 days in the wild stealth camping. Our parents knew where we were and our timelines. We also gave a heads up to the local authorities, just in case, but I don't think they cared much. Day 1 to 4 went without a hitch, and we had a lot of fun. But just as day 5 was ending, and we were getting ready to set up camp, we heard some noises coming from deep into the forest. They weren't what you'd call suspicious noises, but they were still weird, you know? Some shouting, but not angry or panicky or anything, just neutral shouting, which honestly just made it weirder, since it felt so unnatural, especially because after that, everything went quiet. You can hear a leaf falling kind of quiet. 5 young adults. 5 fit, reasonably skilled, and well-equipped young adults on an adventure. I don't think we were dumb to go check it out. Hindsight is a bitch, and no one really knows. Maybe we were already doomed just for being close enough to hear whatever the hell it was. I prefer not to think about it too much. Fact of the matter is, we went straight in the direction the shouting came from. We walked maybe 4 or 5 minutes through a very dense forest without seeing anything. None of us were scared or anything like that. We were curious. We thought it could be a trail party. The sun was going down and it was getting dark when we saw a small clearing with a lit bonfire and 2 small tents. We approached it and started shouting, asking if there was anybody home, but were met with complete silence. And as we got closer, I felt this sudden dread, like when you realize you're making a huge mistake. But I didn't stop. I don't know why. I should have told everyone to get back, but I didn't. As we checked out their campsite, things started getting progressively weirder. The bonfire was far from extinguishing, and the tents were immaculate. They had left their backpacks behind as well as some bottles and magic mushrooms. There were tracks, a lot of them, shoe prints going everywhere in no discernible fashion, as if whoever had made them kept changing their mind of where they should go. At this point, we were in total darkness, save for our own flashlights and the bonfire, so we were getting pretty creeped out. We had decided that whatever this was, it wasn't any of our business and we should scatter. But still, there was this curiosity, this awful nagging feeling in the back of my mind, and I called out into the woods one last time. "Where are you?" And then silence, until finally we heard a raspy voice answering, "Where are you?" back, whispering in a voice so similar to mine that it didn't even register at first. It was almost as if someone had recorded me and played it back. Then, cackling came, and the sound of leaves being crunched, and at that point we were panicking, so we started running. You ever ran at night in the woods with a flashlight? It's hard, and when Lucia fell, I swear no one noticed. We would have been back for her if we had. I swear we would, but we didn't hear her falling. Honestly, we didn't hear a single thing other than the sound of something following us. She didn't scream, and the thing following us for sure didn't stop to take her. I have no idea where we lost her. We ran for what felt like an eternity. Even after the thing stopped following us, we just kept running. It's honestly a miracle no one else got left behind. It's tough. It's really tough. We didn't only lose her, we lost our maps too. We had no idea where we were, and there was no sign of any trail we could follow. Lucia was our leader, and without her, we got lost. We tried backtracking, tried finding her, but we didn't. We didn't find the campsite either. We must have been turned around about 1,000,000 times while running, because even after 3 hours looking for any sign of them, we found nothing. Not a single thing. But the worst part is that when we tried setting up camp to sleep, the thing came back. We could hear it. It was laughing, whispering gibberish in the night. Its voice human, but it felt so unnatural, so stinted. We panicked again and ran, and in our panic, we left everything we had behind. Every rope and every can, all we needed to survive. After that, well, our group collapsed. We couldn't trust one another. We spent 2 entire days together in these woods before being found, and during these 2 days, we barely slept. We didn't eat. We had some water, but nowhere near enough for everyone, and we fought over it. It got bad. It got really bad. Sometimes I think I could even hear that fucking thing laughing at us, mocking our pain. But then, a hiker found us, and the park rangers came and got everything. I don't know. I don't feel like it got better. I still don't feel better, even after 3 years. I was the one who spoke with Lucia's parents. I'm the only one who had the guts to. Everyone thinks she got kidnapped by someone. Everyone thinks we stumbled upon some druggies and things got ugly. We had an airtight plan. We just didn't account for other people hurting us. It happens, people told me, while the world forgot about it and Lucia's disappearance got buried under the news cycle. But I knew Lucia, and I saw the pain in her parents' eyes. Open and shut case my ass.